How is the experience of doing what you do for you guys? Do you think of it as something that's dangerous or other, or for you guys, is it just like breathing? Is it so a part of who you are?
Yes, there's a level of danger in what we do, but I've worked with people who literally put their lives on the line every day and have been killed because they're protecting our natural world and our wildlife.
Ever since I was a little girl, I have wanted to do what I'm doing now. The thing I wake up thinking about every day, and it's the thing I go to bed thinking about every day. Not because I want to make a beautiful film, but because I want to make a difference. I think everyone that gets into wildlife filmmaking has the same passion.
What would be like your dream, I guess, when it comes to the broader spectrum of what filmmaking can be and the types of stories that we can tell?
Dream is what's happening right now. Where I'm from, let's say in Mfowe, some years back we had a lot of rhinos and they were poached to extinction. It's a sad story for me, but also it's like a reminder to say if we don't take care of what we have, we can easily lose them.
What we do affects other places halfway across the planet. And so for me, trying to connect that with the audience, simple everyday actions that we do and we do make a difference.
Knowing how impactful film is, I thought I can use my skills to tell stories about my wildlife so that our animals can be preserved for future generations to come.
The privilege we have to work on something as important, Planet Earth 3, to highlight not only how beautiful this world is, but also how fragile it is and how little time we've got left.
What for you makes being away from your families, being away from your partners, being away from your child, what makes it worth it?
It's born from passion, it's born from growing up and loving and breathing these wild spaces and wanting to protect them.
My son's 17 and I've missed half his life by doing this job. But you kind of have to. We're really privileged in the skills we've acquired and the access we have and the job we have to do. We have to impassion people as to this extraordinary planet. We have to highlight what is going wrong in this world. And we have to showcase extraordinary people.
They don't see it as being in service. They see it as something that they love, something that they're fortunate to be able to do. And I was really struck by the humility in that.